session of the conference. This session is called Using the ACS to Study Racial and Ethnic Subgroups. Our first speaker today is Peggy Shea, who is a data analyst at the Department of Population Health at NYU Grossman School of Medicine. Her presentation is called Mapping Census Tract Level Age and Racial Ethnic Breakdown on the City Health Dashboard using American Community Survey data. Take it away, Peggy.
Thank you so much, Diana. Let me share my screen here. So thank you again. As Diana said, my name is Pei Yang Shea. I also go by Peggy. My pronouns are she, her, and I'm a data analyst for the City Health Dashboard, which is within the Department of Population Health in the NYU School of Medicine. And today I'll be talking about one of our dashboard features called demographic maps and tables. And so first I'm going to start off with an introduction to what the City Health Dashboard is, and then I'm going to dive into our maps features. So the City Health Dashboard is an online, publicly available, interactive website data platform. We have over 35 measures of health, the factors that shape health, and the drivers of health equity to help guide local solutions, 750 US cities. And as you can see on the map here, each of these blue dots represent one of the cities on our dashboard. So we have cities all across the US with approximately populations over 50,000. The City Health Dashboard can be used in a variety of ways. You can use it to compare health gaps across neighborhoods, compare your city to cities in other regions or with similar populations, as well as set priorities and better target resources. As you can see on the image on the right here, this shows life expectancy by census tract in Columbus, Ohio. And you can see how even in census tracts that are right next to each other, life expectancy can really vary. And so these are the types of differences that you can see through the data that we provide on the dashboard. Here's a list of all the different metrics that we have on our dashboard, along with their respective underlying data sources. So we have metrics across these 5 different health domains. And you can see the ones that are boxed in red here are the ones that have ACS as the underlying data source. And something that's really exciting is we're always looking to add new metrics to the dashboard. And one of the new metrics that we're adding soon is broadband connection. And so this one also uses ACS as the underlying data source, and we'll be adding it coming up in June. So now I'm going to dive into the demographic maps features. So first, why are these maps important? So racial ethnic population groups are swiftly growing in the US, especially Asian and Hispanic subgroups. And so it's becoming increasingly important for city leaders and other stakeholders to know the demographic makeup of their city. And often demographic information is only available in broad categories, such as Asian or like other category. And this type of data aggregation in broad categories can mask potential health disparities. And also, oftentimes, city stakeholders, especially those in smaller or mid-sized cities, they may lack data capacity or analytic skills to identify neighborhoods that would benefit from resources and interventions. And so to address this gap and the importance of having more granular data, the dashboard added demographic maps to the site. We added them in October 2020. They include census tract level maps for all of our dashboard cities. And so we use census tract as a proxy for neighborhood. And for these maps, you're able to filter for age or race ethnicity subgroups and percent foreign born. And in the following slides, I will walk through like how that works. And then in addition to these census tract level maps, we also have city level data provided in table formats, which again, you'll see in a later slide. So this slide shows a screenshot of the City Health Dashboard on the city overview page specifically. The city overview page has 3 different tabs. One provides an overview of the metrics and metric data that we provide for the site. And then the other 2 outlined in red here are the ones that have our demographic information. So the demographics overview tab is the one that has the city level data presented in table format. And then the demographics by census tract tab has the demographic maps. And you see on the bottom here, it's where the filters are. So as I mentioned earlier, you're able to filter for either an age category or a race, ethnicity, and percent foreign born category. And just to show you a little bit more on how the filters work, if one of the subgroups that you select has additional subgroups underneath it, then additional filters will pop up. So in the example up here, if we selected Asian as the race ethnicity category, then you'll see another filter pop up where you can select an Asian subgroup. And if they're even more disaggregated, then you'll see another filter pop up as shown below on the screen here. So this example shows if you selected Asian as the race ethnicity, then you could select South Asian as the Asian subgroup. And then within that, you can select Pakistani, for example, for the South Asian subgroup. And after selecting the filters, it will populate the demographic map below. Here's a screenshot of the map that appears. This one shows Pakistani population in Atlanta, Georgia. And you can see on the upper right is all the different information for this map. And so you can see that the Pakistani population is about 0.1% of the total city population. And in some census tracts, there can be up to 1.1% of a single census tract. And so the scale bar here shows population density with darker colors indicating higher population density. So if you look on the map here, you'll see that the darker green census tracts are where there's a higher density of Pakistani residents in this given city. Here's just one other example. We're using New York City. And as I mentioned, we have percent foreign born data on the site. So this example shows the percent of foreign born Black population in New York City. And again, you can see that although they make up about 7.9% of the total New York City population, in some neighborhoods, they can make up to about 67.9% of that neighborhood's population, as indicated in the dark green areas across the city here. And here's an example of what the city level data table look like. So these tables are expandable if you look at a race ethnicity subgroup or race ethnicity group that has subgroups beneath it. So this example shows if you were looking at the Asian population, you can further expand the table to look at the East Asian population and then to the subgroups within the East Asian group. And you'll notice on the bottom here that some of these percentages have a blue icon next to them, the triangle with the exclamation point. And so basically when we decided to create these demographic maps, we really want to provide as much data as possible, as granular data as possible. But at the same time, we wanted to be able to flag to users that some of these estimates are small and thus unstable. So we use these blue icons on the site to indicate when a specific estimate is a small and potentially unstable estimate and that it should be interpreted with caution. And so you will see these on the site. So our data is from the ACS. As I mentioned, we specifically use 5-year estimates. The current estimates displayed on the site are from 2018, but we are updating to 2019 data soon in June. And we have specific racial ethnic subgroups for not only the Asian population, but also the Hispanic and Native Hawaiian or other Pacific Islander population. And these subgroup classifications were based on data availability and expert consultation. And one of the groups that we partnered with to develop this is the NYU Center for the Study of Asian American Health. So we just wanted to give a big shout out to them for all of their guidance in the development of these maps. As I mentioned, we also provide data for Hispanic subgroups. So this is just an example showing the Cuban population in Ann Arbor, Michigan. And again, on this awesome map here, you can see that in the darker green census tracts are where there are a higher density of Cuban residents living in the city. So the demographic maps can be used in a lot of different ways. Here are some potential use cases. They could be helpful in adding tract level population demographic breakdowns to reports or to grant applications. They can also be used to pinpoint areas for outreach or identify potential locations for expansion or services to additional sites. They can also be helpful in providing detailed information on the geographic distribution of smaller racial ethnic population subgroups. One example of how this could be used is oftentimes for people that are doing like Asian American health research, non-Chinese subgroups are not commonly available and are often their data are masked by larger Asian subgroups such as Chinese populations. And so these demographic maps can be really useful when you're trying to dig into data for groups that are not commonly available. And so just walking through one more example is showing how these demographic maps can be used. This map here shows for Salt Lake City, the Native Hawaiian or other Pacific Islander group. And as you can see on the map here, Native Hawaiian or other Pacific Islanders make up about 2.2% of the total city population, and in some neighborhoods up to 10.9% of the specific census tract. And you can see that the darker green neighborhoods are on the bottom left here. However, if you dig into a really more specific subgroup, for example, the Native Hawaiian subgroup within the larger Nopi population, you can see that there appear on like the upper right census tracts of the city. So here this shows that even though in the overall Nopi group, most of the Nopi residents live in that lower left census tract, where you dig in deeper, the map can look different because specific subgroup residents live in different areas of the city. And so with that, thank you so much. Please feel free to stay in touch with either myself or the City Health Dashboard as a whole. Our information is on the screen here. And with that, I'm happy to answer any questions.
Thanks so much, Peggy. We're actually going to hold questions until the end. And I want to announce a slight change to the schedule. We're going to have Jean Gaboulet go second in this session here. She is principal at Lapkoff and Gaboulet Demographic Research, and her presentation is titled, All Asians Are Not Alike, Using ACS and Administrative Data Estimates of Asian Subgroups in Political Redistricting. I think, Jean, you're on mute.
Sorry. Thank you. I'm from a very small demographic research company in California in the San Francisco Bay Area. My company was founded about 30 years ago. We have a wonderful URL, www.demographers.com, and this has brought us a little bit of attention, but we do just custom demographic research for mostly nonprofit and local government entities. One of the kinds of services we've provided since the very beginning is to help counties, cities, school districts, and special districts like water districts change from at-large to by district election of their governing boards. This was prompted starting in the late 1980s and early 90s by various Federal Voting Rights Act challenges, so that that started jurisdictions moving toward by district election of representatives for governing boards. Then the California Voting Rights Act was passed in the early 2000s, which gave people the opportunity to raise challenges under the California Voting Rights Act, which is more generous in the conditions for a successful challenge. So we've had a lot of work over the years, especially after the 2010 and 2020 censuses, to help with districting and redistricting projects. We are using various sources in our work. It seems like every election, every census brings us to needing more data, more specific data for redistricting projects. And it's quite interesting, and I'll tell you about this in my presentation. My business partner, Shelley Lapkoff, and our GIS assistant, Robin Merrill, all contributed to this research and to this paper presentation. Here's our website landing page in case you wanted to check us out. We, in this part of the United States, are in Silicon Valley. Silicon Valley has become increasingly diverse in population over the years. And since 2000 especially, but starting a bit earlier, there was a big increase of Asian high-tech workers immigrating for jobs here. And many of them stayed and were naturalized. Many of them were from China and India, but that's just a tiny bit of the immigration from various parts of the world attracted by the high tech here. People from Africa and Europe and other parts of Asia all work here. And they tend, as high tech workers, to be fairly well educated. And many who have become citizens are culturally, socially, and politically involved. So there have been big changes in the diversity, increases in the diversity of the population here. Increasingly, we find Asian subgroups members want separate recognition during redistricting. It's sort of like in Cuba, in Florida, Cubans and Mexicans tend to vote differently and are really separate communities of interest. Well, this is true for the Asian population as well. Asian subgroups that we have come across that want separate consideration when redistricting and view themselves as quite different from each other include Afghan Americans and Asian Indians, Chinese Americans, and many other groups. But the ones that I'm going to talk about in our two case studies are the Afghans, Asian Indians, and Chinese Americans. For this kind of investigation, the PL data, the official redistricting data released by the Census Bureau, usually much earlier than it's going to happen this year, is not enough because only the Asian category is enumerated, not these subgroups. The two case studies I'm going to discuss today are first one case where Afghan Americans wanted consideration in a redistricting project, and the other where Asian Indians and Chinese Americans wanted to be considered separately. PL data, as I said, are not enough. We have been using 2010 SF2 information for Asian subgroups. The latest American Community Survey and its predecessors give us data on citizen voting age population, or CVAP, by race and ethnicity, including the Asian subgroups that are important to us. We also use data, administrative data, from county registrars of voters from a centralized website or an organization in California called the Statewide Database. The Statewide Database collects from each county the register of voters and data on voter turnout. The statewide database also uses surname classification or surnames to estimate the ethnic or racial origin of populations, including Hispanic subgroups and Asian subgroups. Sorry, going the wrong way. Okay, the first case study is of Fremont, California, the city that moved from at-large to by district elections in 2017. We were called in to help with this project, and we had to follow a very tight timeline because the city was under a California Voting Rights Act challenge that limited the amount of time, drastically limited the amount of time they had to finish redistricting the city council. The second case study is actually still an attorney-client privileged project for us, so I can't give you a whole lot of details, but this particular jurisdiction is considering whether to move to by-district elections, and board members for this jurisdiction wanted to treat Chinese and Asian Indian Americans as separate communities of interest. The right-hand map shows Fremont's location in the southeastern San Francisco Bay Area. On the left is the city council map that they adopted, the district map. There are 6 city council members representing individual pieces of the city and a mayor elected at large. That's why there are only 6 election districts, city council districts. We did a lot of maps for them. We start out with a couple of draft maps and take suggestions to modify those maps or create entirely new ones. So here are some people looking at different scenarios that we gave them for districting. There was a whole lot of community involvement in this project. The California Voting Rights Challenge was brought by, I believe it was Hispanics, but there aren't very many Hispanics in Fremont. It, though, is very diverse, and it has large Asian subgroup populations. The city's current population is around 250,000. And it's sometimes called Little Kabul because it's the largest concentration of Afghan Americans in the United States. And almost 20 years ago, there were about 25,000 Afghan Americans. Probably there are more now. The Afghan Americans came out in large numbers to comment about their characteristics as being an important community of interest, reasons for being important communities of interest. There were dozens of Afghan Americans who turned out, some needed translators, but they pointed out that they should not be overlooked. This map shows registered voters by surname in the city. The purple color is Chinese Americans. The orange is Asian Indians, and Korean is pink. You can't see many pie slices that color. Light blue Japanese, light green Vietnamese, and yellow Filipino. And you can sort of see some concentrations of the different subgroups on this map. This is block level CVAP estimates from the California statewide database, registered voter database, aggregated to voting precincts, which we take into account when we draw election district boundaries, because registrars of voters really want us to try to use the existing precinct boundaries if possible. This map shows Afghan ancestry population estimates from the American Community Survey. You can see that there are some concentrations, important concentrations in separate parts of the city, but they're really very small, with a total of less than 25,000 people out of a city of almost 250,000. These populations are fairly small, and you might think they're not very important for redistricting purposes because they're so small. And that's true that under the Federal Voting Rights Act, they would not be considered capable of forming a majority in a single election district. But under the California Voting Rights Act, that's not the case. Afghan populations are then therefore not to the same scale in the previous maps. This is the PL data from 2010. We did this work in 2017. So you can see the major race ethnic categories in Fremont. Again, you can see some concentrations. The turquoise color shows Asians, all Asians combined. And you can see that the city has many Asians in it. This map shows for each 2010 census tract what share of the total population was Chinese American, and that's the pink piece of each pie. The gray parts of the pies are for all other groups. This is the Asian Indian subgroup population distribution. So in some census tracts, there were higher concentrations of Asian Indians than others, just as is the case for Chinese Americans. Here is the adopted city council map. And in the middle, in this area, if you can see my cursor, between city council districts 2 and 3, we changed the boundary, not by very much, but we changed the boundary to keep the Afghan population in a single city council district to the extent possible. Our second case study is of another jurisdiction. And so far, it is attorney-client privilege because we're just talking to the attorneys for the jurisdiction as well as board members. We've been doing some background studies for them, and they asked us to search for evidence that supports considering Chinese Americans and Asian Indians as separate communities of interest that ought to be respected when drawing lines instead of all Asian populations, these subgroups. And they're numerous enough to be important and significant. Our first step was to identify the geographical concentrations of subgroup voters, both registered and actual voters in the jurisdiction in each voting precinct. And again, these are surnamed-based estimates, not based in ACS, and certainly not in PL. And there are other ways of getting at this, but this has worked best for us. The second step was to study voting patterns of subgroups by voting precinct using ecological regression and ecological inference, which are the methods now accepted by the courts to show whether there is racially polarized voting. It's also useful in seeing if these different subgroups vote differently. One of the jurisdiction's board members is Asian Indian, and another is Chinese, actually Taiwanese American. Within Asian Indian categories, there are different subgroups, and the jurisdiction board member who prompted the inquiry into Asian subgroups was actually a Sikh. He's very, very interested in being called a Sikh, which is a distinctive group within the population of India. And Taiwanese Americans are a subgroup of the Chinese Americans. We did a whole series of these racially polarized voting studies, and the end result was to show that Chinese and Asian Indian voters sometimes support different candidates. And the yellow highlighting on this slide shows in the top panel moderate evidence of racially polarized voting. And that's for Chinese voters in the 2018 election. So moderate evidence in that election that Chinese and Asian Indian, Chinese surname people voted tending to vote for Chinese surname candidates. And the bottom panel shows little evidence of racially polarized voting in that election by Asian surname voters. These tables are just summaries of what we did. And I think of great value are these charts that show the correlation essentially between Chinese surname voters and the specific group to which the candidate belonged. So the horizontal axis shows the share of the voters who voted for this particular Chinese American candidate. And you can see that there is a correlation, although it's the margin of error as you go towards the upward right gets broader and broader because there's so few case studies there. But the next slide shows Chinese surname candidate, the Chinese surname candidate was slightly preferred by Asian Indian surname voters, which is also quite interesting. So this is where there was no evidence of racially polarized voting. In this case, there was a negative correlation between the Asian and Chinese voters' preferences for Asian Indian candidate. In conclusion, political redistricting work is quite complicated, and the longer we've done it, the more complicated it's gotten. We found increasingly it's important to distinguish among race ethnic subgroups when redistricting. In Silicon Valley, the San Francisco Bay Area, Chinese and Asian Indian surname residents consider themselves to be separate communities of interest, and there is some evidence from the racially polarized voting analysis that this is the case. These voting behaviors, as well as testimony by subgroup members in open meetings and in closed session meetings, both suggest that they be treated as separate communities of interest. So we need data from 3 sources in order to account for all of this. We certainly need the PL data for districting counts. We need American community surveys of estimates of the citizen voting age population by race, ethnicity, and we need the local administrative data. In this case, voter data, in order to distinguish among these separate communities of interest. Sometimes these communities of interest are small, which adds a lot of uncertainty when we examine correlations like I just showed you in order to find evidence, whether there's evidence of racially polarized voting. It's getting more complicated, and unfortunately the PL data don't meet all of our needs. The ACS takes us pretty far in the direction of getting what we need, but we still need to use local administrative data to distinguish among the subgroups. It's a great challenge. it's very interesting and exciting to be able to do this work because it's research work. It's not just making pretty maps. It's meaningful, and it helps form public policy and helps with the formation of voting districts. That's all I have to say today. So
Thank
I
you
will
so
stop
much.
sharing. Yeah.
Thank you so much, Jean. Such great and important work. Our third speaker today is Matthew Berman, who is a professor of economics at the University of Alaska's Institute of Social and Economic Research. His presentation is called Rural Urban Migration of Alaska Native Peoples, Changing Patterns and Causes.
Yeah, thank you. I understand somebody's going to be sharing my slides. Not sure who it is, though. Thank you. There
Yep,
it is. So
looks
yes,
like it is up.
I failed the bandwidth test. I guess I'm, so good morning. It's still morning here in Alaska. And I would like to talk about research on rural urban migration of Alaska Native people. So if you could go to the next slide, please. So first, what do we mean by rural and urban? And that is a little different in Alaska than it is in other places, and doesn't necessarily work very well with the census geography because, well, as we'll see, I'm actually within the municipality of Anchorage, so it's definitely very urban, but I am far enough out in the boonies so that I don't have decent broadband. So we'll be talking about, some people need to understand a little bit about the local geography of Alaska. So Alaska became a state in 1959, and there were no organized county governments at the time. And so the state created a legislation to create local governments, and they would be called boroughs, which is a county except it's got enhanced powers. In particular, a county in Alaska, a borough, is a school district. There's no, you can't have multiple school districts within a given borough. And if you have a borough, you have to take responsibility for public schools. And the boroughs would enter as they organized. And in the meantime, the Census Bureau had divided up Alaska into these census areas. And the census areas are basically county sized. And in many cases, the boroughs actually incorporated a census area with the exact boundaries, but that didn't always work out. It wasn't always the case. And so one of the challenges with looking at mobility over the years is that the local government boundaries are constantly, they're changing. They could change every year, and that it makes some complications. So to try to, what we're doing is looking at sort of research over a long period of time. And although it's 25 years of research, it spans data back to 1985, in the 1990 census. And so of course that predates the ACS, but from the census long form. And so to do this research, could you go to the next slide, please? And it shows the county governments. And as I already talked about that. So next slide, please. So there. So what has changed relatively less are the public use microdata data areas, the PUMS, and there are five PUMS, although Anchorage is divided up into two. So we really think about the four regions in Alaska. And PUMA 400, which you see encompasses most of the state, is what we call rural Alaska. And it has a number of those census areas and boroughs in it. In rural Alaska, PUMA 400 is not connected by road. That's important. It's not connected by road to any other part of the state. So you can't drive there, and it means that mobility is a little more complicated. You have to, basically you're flying back and forth. In the southeastern Alaska part of Puma 400, people can take a ferry. And urban is really Anchorage, 100, but we also include 200 and 300. So basically everything else is considered urban, although most of the migration is between Puma 400 and Anchorage, Puma 100, 101, and 102. Okay, so next slide, please. So this is our basic theoretical framework that we've used from the beginning. And this I've been working with a number of colleagues over the years, but this particular, we started this is with Professor Huskey, Lee Huskey, and we sort of defined migration as the idea for modeling mobility is that migration is really an indicator of relative well-being, that people move when they think that things are better, life is better for them in another place. And in Alaska, it's a little bit more complicated because in rural Alaska, this is a mixed economy, and there are many, many people are still involved in subsistence harvesting of fish and game out on the land. And in particular, in Puma 400, we talk about a mixed economy, a mixed subsistence cash economy. People, fresh meat in particular, fresh meat and fish is very expensive and hard to come by. And so people just go out on the land and get it there. And in urban Alaska, you have lots and lots of people, and people go to the grocery store. So it's pretty much a mainstream economy. So next slide, please. So what's important to note, when we got looking at the patterns of mobility, this is with my colleague Lance Howe, we identified that people didn't generally move from these small villages of less than 1,000 people straight to an urban area. Instead, there was this noticeable stepping stones pattern where people would be moving from a very small community to a regional hub, which are these communities between like 2,000 and 6,000 or 7,000 people that are still in the rural region, but they're actually small towns. And then from there, people who lived in those places would move to, say, Anchorage or Fairbanks. And then the people who were indigenous people living in Anchorage would be moving sometimes back and forth to the other states. But there was, something like 2/3 of the migration between these really small villages went to regional centers. It's very, very pronounced. Next slide, please. And so, the research is all involved in modeling microdata. So we're talking about, the individual records, and some of the research we are doing. Originally, we started with the public use microdata itself. And then later on, we moved to, we got permission to access the microdata from the full census records, long form records, and then later on the American Community Survey in the Census Research Data Center program. And so we understood that drivers of well-being in a place, what made people want to be in a place, it's more than just the cash economy. It also includes living costs and the subsistence economy. So people wanted to be, they really did care about that. And that was a big cost. If you moved from a rural area where there was less cash economy, more subsistence, to an urban area where you couldn't do subsistence very well, but the cash economy was much stronger. And we also noticed the big gender differences in the patterns of migration. And this is sort of common in many places in the Arctic, that more women were involved in the wage economy. They were getting more education, and in contrast, the men were more engaged in subsistence. It was still more important to them culturally. And so you actually got gender differences in migration. Next slide, please. Sorry, the first research that we did was with the public use sample, and this is with Lee Huskey. And what we found here, this shows the graphs, sort of what did we find? And we see that there's a lot of mobility in both directions. People are moving. So we get about 10% a year of rural Alaskans who move to urban areas. That's a very large number, but half of them move back. And so the net migration to urban areas was relatively small. It was like 1% a year, and that was smaller than the natural, or about the same as the natural increase. So the populations are very stable in rural Alaska, while the urban native population grew. And let me just make sure I understand. Alaska natives are American Indian Alaska Native population, so the AIAN identification, and native indigenous to Alaska. Next slide, please. So maybe I should, can we go back to the previous slide? I want to mention one thing there about that relative earnings. It's important there to see that there are some gender differences between men and women that are important, and they don't show up for some reason. They don't show up there. The pink is women, and the blue is men there. So there's differences there that are actually statistically significant. So go to the next page, please. So as we move forward in time, we now go to 1995 to 2000. And here we were able to do a study where we could study the differences between Alaska Native people in the United States and their counterparts in Arctic Canada. And it's important for us to know that the Arctic, many of these people, the majority of these people are Inuit ethnicity, and the Inuit ethnicity is also the majority of the Arctic, most of the Arctic and indigenous people in Canada. So they're ethnically very similar. So we can do so where there's not really and their economy is very similar as well. They're both involved in subsistence cash mixed economy. So we can actually compare what's the difference between the institutional, how do the institutions in the two countries affect migration patterns. And here we can see that there are many similarities that, surprisingly, older people are more likely to move than younger people, which is, contrary to what we would think. But it has to do with often it's older people moving for health reasons, better health care, and also to be near children who had moved. And even though the children were moving at slower rates, they were also over time they would accumulate more younger people in the urban areas, because But in what's also, we also noticed was that and of course, predicted earnings are important, and their predicted harvest, and I'll talk about where the harvest comes from in a minute, because it's not in the census, obviously. But also we noticed that housing and cost of living were impediments. So people would not go to a place that had higher cost of living and lousy housing. And this research, we took advantage of this. This was actually done at the Census Data Center in the United States with the 2000 long form survey data. And in Canada, we actually had access to the microdata in Canada at their research data center program. And so we were working with very large samples of pretty much the entire population in Canada and half the population, because the sampling rates for the long form survey in rural Alaska was about close to average around 50%. Very large, very much the population as a whole. Okay, next slide, please. And so this is about, where do we get the information on subsistence harvesting? Well, that comes from the Survey of Living Conditions in the Arctic, which is a survey sponsored by the National Science Foundation, and it was, but it was also in the United States, but also in Canada had funding from the Canadian, whatever it's called there, their SSHRC, Social Science and Humanities Research Council, and from Greenland, and in the Scandinavian countries, actually in Europe. But we looked at just the data in North America and Greenland, where again, we're talking about predominantly Inuit populations, so there's similar ethnicities. And we were able to estimate, sort of predict household earnings and place components of earnings and on harvest from the harvest data that were in SLICA. And we used the predictions from those equations to prediction to use, since those predictions were based on information that was in the census and the ACS. So we could apply those predictions to generate predicted harvests from census data. And that's how we did that for those other the studies I mentioned. But here we're showing how the effect of household and place contributions. So excuse me, the SLICA survey doesn't actually have mobility, but it has a migration intent question. It's like, are you serious? It was very specific. Are you seriously, or have you seriously considered moving to another community within the past 5 years? And about 40% of the people said yes to that question, and 60% said no. And so we modeled that here, and it shows that it really was predictable that people who were unhappy about the earnings available in their community were more likely to leave, especially in Alaska and Canada. But it wasn't, this is so that you see in all cases that the household people who are more able to earn money because of their household characteristics, generally younger and better educated, they were more likely to move. But the place contribution, interestingly, was positive in Canada. So it's interesting that people who could, in a place where they could earn money, actually were more likely to leave. And the explanation for that is really quite clear. If you look at the geography of Canada, you'll see that those Arctic places are really, really far from the urban areas in southern Canada. And it costs a ton of money to move, thousands of dollars actually to take a plane. And so these are people who actually can make enough money to leave. They want to leave anyway, and then actually make enough money to afford to move their families. And it's not true in the other places. And the harvest, you can see harvests are, if you're in a place where there's better harvest, you're not likely to move in Alaska or Canada. But in Greenland, and also here we have data from the Chukotka region in Russia, subsistence harvesting is basically considered an employer of last resort. And so if you're in a place where there's better harvesting opportunities, you don't want to do that. You want to go to a place where there's more earnings. And so those countries, those areas are really quite different from the North American countries. Okay, next slide, please. So this is just a little side note here. We had access to other microdata in Alaska that are unique to Alaska that we could use to see if we got different results with that than we did with census data. And these studies that we were looking at how fuel costs might have increased outmigration from rural Alaska using data from the Alaska Permanent Fund Dividend applications. So many of you know that Alaska has a sort of what I call a basic income program, but it's a program where all residents of the state can receive, they sign up to receive an annual, a portion of the annual earnings of the state's sovereign wealth fund, the permanent fund. And everybody's eligible except basically convicted felons who are actually in jail. Once you get out of jail, you can reapply and get your permanent fund dividends. But it's basically it's basically free money if you apply. And the applications, of course, have to tell you, your name. You have to have your address and your age and gender. So it's got that basic demographic data, and the state allowed us to. We actually were able to match these to employment records from their workman's comp and unemployment insurance program by social security number. So those are very private data, and we worked out a system with them where we could have them run equations for us that we would write the code and they would run them for us. And that was a wonderful arrangement. And we did this study, and we were looking at the question that was, the fuel costs, as you know, rose nationally in the mid-2000s. And in rural Alaska, this is a huge cost of living problem because it's cold. People have heating oil for their homes, and they need gasoline for motorboats and snow machines, and it's a very large part of the cost of living. And so questions, was this driving people out of rural Alaska? And the answer was, well, yeah, a little bit, but not very much. The magnitude, it was significant, but the magnitude was really small. And it meant that maybe another 1% of the population left rural Alaska because of this. But it did show us that living costs do matter. And we need to pay more attention to see if that's changing. And so this brings us to the last research we'll talk about, which is, again, at the Research Data Center, but this is now going from 2000 to the present, or not quite the present. We got to 2016 or 17 or so. So 15, it says 2015, but it's 2015 where they were in 2015. Yeah, it's 2016. So this is it shows that when we actually studied this and we looked at cost of living, and fuel prices is really the best indicator of cost of living in rural Alaska, and earnings, we noticed this striking point where it's in going back and looking again at 2000. Again, 2000, that's the Census long form survey. Earnings really mattered, and fuel prices were important, but they weren't, they weren't really an issue, and they weren't as big an issue. And then you see, once you get into the American Community Survey in the more recent years, wow, it just shifts, and earnings become less and less an issue. In fact, even a negative effect, whereas the cost of living becomes more, stays prominent and actually grows a little bit. But also we notice that people are just moving to urban areas for no reason that's not really apparent in the census data. So there's some urban preference, that's something else that's going on. People just wanting to move to urban areas for maybe social and cultural reasons and not for economic reasons. And so next slide, please. Just a side note here, many of you know that the American Community Survey has a 1-year mobility window. It's like, where did you live last year, a year ago? Whereas the Census Alarm Form was, where did you live 5 years ago? So we wanted to make sure that we adjusted for that, of course. And we did, and we found that it was very, we could actually replicate the equations of the ACS that we did with the Census Long Form, but the odds of moving increased by about, a little over twice as much in 5 years as 1 year. So it means that either people are moving one, it's like, how does that happen? Well, people are moving back and forth a lot, as we said. And so you might see them in urban areas, and then by 5 years later, they might be, many of them might be back in the rural area. You see, so you got to be careful. Now that's specific to Alaska Native people, and it might be different anywhere else, but it shows that we actually can make the correspondence between the two sources of data. Okay, so next slide, please. So just to summarize and synthesize what we've learned over this period, and we've seen that the main drivers of rural-urban migration have changed, while the flows, sort of the migration itself continues similar. It hasn't changed very much, but the reasons people are moving, which affects where they're moving from and to, and who's moving, those changes have changed. And see, originally in the pre-2000 era, it was really earnings, and there were big gender earnings differences and big gender differences in migration. And since then, since 2000, the past 20 years, living costs have become much more important. And subsistence still is important to people in rural Alaska, but high fuel costs affect that too. So it makes it it's a double effect. The cost of living, buying food, it goes up, and the cost of harvesting it goes up, as do heating costs. And other factors probably have increased too, but they're not easily identified in census data. And so we need to do other studies to identify what they are. Okay, well, thank you. I think that's all I have. We can go to the last slide. I think it's just sets questions. Yes. And I just here want to acknowledge my financial support, and also my colleague, Rachel Wang Sendejas, who is a co-author in that final study on the ACS and 2005 to 2016 data.
Thank you. Thank you so much. Well, now we'll go into questions, and I just want to invite all of our speakers to turn their cameras on. And our first question about will Peggy be posting her presentation? We have got that posted now, so it's showing up for me on the bottom of this session under session content. So on to the next one. Peggy, is there a way to download the data from the City Health dashboard?
That's an excellent question. The answer is yes, with a caveat. So our data are available for download through our site. If you're on the City Health dashboard, you would just click on data access within the menu. And if you're first time accessing our site, there would just be a really brief survey for you to fill out. And then after that, you'll be able to see the data access page and download all our data. So our data are available for download through zip files by state, or you can download all of our dashboard data And the downloadable data files would only have the most recent year of data. So if you wanted multi-year data, you could access that through our API. And so you would be able to obtain like an API username and token from us on the dashboard as well. And then the caveat that I'm about to mention is, as of now, the demographic maps and tables data that I presented on are not available in our downloadable data, but we do hope that in the future we'd be able to provide that as well. So the current downloadable data is data on all of our metrics for all of our cities, but it does not include the demo maps data.
Great, thank you. Next question is for Jean. Are there similar databases like the California statewide database for other states?
Well, the short answer is I don't know the specifics of it. The California statewide database is funded by the state of California. So if I were looking in another state, I would start out by seeing if the state has a central location to access voter registration and turnout data. The next step would be, if your state doesn't have such a thing, is to look for county level organizations, government organizations that have such data. In California, it's the California registrars of voters that keep track of the voter rolls now, and the statewide database just gets the data from the counties. The equivalent of counties in other states, including things like cities, and sometimes cities organize their own elections and maintain their own voter rolls, or maybe in Alaska, boroughs, I don't know, and other things that are local jurisdictions, not statewide, might be a good source of information. If you can't get something like California statewide database information, and the California statewide database is the official redistricting database for the whole state. If your state or locality doesn't have that level of data, but still maintains voter rolls that you can download, and at least in California, those are public records, you can do your own surname analysis, because there's surname database lists by specific categories like the ones I showed you. And you could do your own surname classification, with the caveat that in some cases, the margins of error aren't known, false positives and false negatives. Like if I'd married someone with the last name of Fernandez, I could be Hispanic, and depending on how it's spelled, I could be Portuguese, or I could be Caucasian, because that's how I came into this world. But in any event, the margins of error are important to attend to, because in some cases they aren't very big, but for some groups they're enormous. Like a last name of Park could be Korean, it could be your English, it could be from many other different countries, and that's difficult to assess or impossible to assess or resolve. Anyway, the short answer was no, I don't know which states have equivalents of the California statewide database, but I think that if you look hard enough, you might be able to find them at the state or local level, or maybe in some cases, private entities do this kind of data gathering.
Thank you. Next question is for our third speaker. It says, I am very interested in your research. Is there a paper you are working on that I can read? And this is from Julia Cho from USDA Rural Development.
Is that for me?
Yeah.
Have her contact me, because some of these are published, but the whole census itself is not yet published, but we're working on it, and there'll be a paper soon. So have her contact me. Thanks.
All right. Next question is for Peggy. Are there any plans to add ancestry or language groups that may not be captured by racial categories, for example, Syrian?
That is such a good question. And the question reminds me of the limitations of like the availability of data. So the short answer is yes, if the data were available for that, we would certainly be interested in adding that to the dashboard. I think that that is such, like adding that nuance and adding that data is so important. I think that in our initial search, we were looking only at race ethnicity data and percent foreign-born data, but I think now I'm really excited to take back to my team the possibility of looking for and adding ancestry or language group data. And so I think, you know, whoever asked the question, if you know of a data source for that, definitely reach out. Really interested in touching base and learning more about where we would be able to find that data and put it on the site. But otherwise, I definitely think that that's an excellent idea, and the nuance would be so important for city leaders and stakeholders to see.
Thank you. Our next question comes from one of our fellow speakers asking another. Matthew says, I want to ask Jean how the implementation of differential privacy in the 2020 census results would affect her work.
It definitely would make me very suspicious of estimates for small populations, relatively small populations and relatively small geographical areas. And it increases the need to have things like voter rolls because that is not subject to differential privacy. In fact, you can, at least in California, see the home addresses of the registered voters if you get the data directly from your county registrar of voters, not the statewide database. The statewide database aggregates the voter records to census blocks and larger entities. I would caution everyone not to use block groups from the American Community Survey because if the numbers are small, you can have huge error margins that render the so-called data or estimates that you get meaningless. Anyhow, it throws another monkey wrench into the works, or another complication, I should say, into the process of doing redistricting work and many other kinds of demographic research, I believe.
Great. Well, last call for questions in the Q&A panel here, and I want to give our speakers the opportunity to ask each other questions, and another one has come in for Jean. Curious to hear more about if you've worked with the Asian communities with qualitative data. I know you had mentioned testimonies in your presentation.
Yes, I've heard many testimonies by individual residents of jurisdictions of all race ethnicities. I've sat through endless board meetings and council meetings and other kinds of governing body meetings, and I've seen citizens and residents come and testify on this subject as well as many others. I also have worked with or been on the same projects as people from various interest groups. And in particular, in this area, there's an Asian Law Alliance that's very, very active in the redistricting field. And some people from that organization, as well as from other organizations that represent the interests of Asian groups and Hispanics and other protected groups especially, that come forward and testify in these public meetings. I haven't worked with them per se, but I have worked alongside them, and in litigation, I have sometimes needed to contradict or try to contradict what they have to say if the evidence suggests that it would be appropriate to do so. And as far as qualitative data go, I would say it's qualitative to record one's opinions or ideas about what one hears. So anything I would write down as being a point of view of someone that I interpreted from what they said would be qualitative. Also, news accounts, newspaper accounts, and blogs and things like that might be useful. But those kind of data are not ones I've used. And I do think testimony is exceedingly important if you can be objective about it. And we view our role, Shelley Lapkoff and I, as being objective assessors of the data.
Thank you so much. Well, those are all the questions we've got, and I know we have about 2 minutes, so I just want to once again thank all of our presenters at this session, and thank you to PRB and for Census for organizing this whole conference. What a great session to end on. So thank you so much. Oh, reminder to please fill out the survey that you'll be getting about feedback for the conference as a whole. And with that, I think everyone